Just a night shift nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer called her when he thought she was out of earshot, standing in the hallway outside room 347 with his residents clustered around him like remoras around a shark. The night shift nurses here think they understand medicine because they've watched a few monitors beep. He didn't know she could hear him through the cracked door. He didn't know that the woman folding linens in the break room at 2,300 hours wasn't actually named Sarah Chen, or rather, she was, but that was only the surface of who she actually was. The SEAL in room 347 would figure it out eventually, but not tonight. Not yet. Cedar Creek Medical stretched across 8 city blocks in Norfolk, a sprawl of concrete and glass that had treated everyone from dock workers to admirals. Sarah Chen moved through its corridors like water finding its level, present but unnoticed, efficient without calling attention to efficiency. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above her head as she pushed the linen cart down the ICU hallway at 11 o'clock at night, the cart's wheels squeaking on polished tile with a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She'd been here 8 months. 8 months of night shifts, 8 months of watching, 8 months of existing in the margins while men like Dr. Mercer conducted business they thought was invisible. It wasn't invisible to her. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and something chemical, probably the industrial cleaner they used on the floors at midnight. Sarah sat down at the small table near the window and began folding the stack of linens from the cart, white sheets becoming precise rectangles under hands that had learned precision in a place most people would recognize only from documentaries. Hospital corners. Military corners. There was barely any difference. Discipline was discipline, whether you were preparing a bed in the surgical ward or preparing a perimeter in the Hindu Kush. Her left forearm bore 3 long scars, pale against her skin, remnants of something she never discussed with colleagues, something that belonged to a different life, a different name, a different uniform. She wore long sleeves now, always, even in the summer heat that rolled off the Atlantic into Norfolk like a living thing. The SEAL from room 347 came in around 23:10. Moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was still negotiating with pain. His name was supposedly Rodriguez. His chart said he was a junior enlisted medic with no combat deployments. His eyes said he was a liar, which meant he was exactly what she was looking for. Navy SEAL Team 3, according to the intelligence brief locked in her head, classified information that would never appear in his official paperwork. They'd put him here 2 weeks ago with what the official report called a training incident. His chest bore a surgical scar that suggested something far more specific than training. He watched her fold the 3rd sheet with movements that seemed to cost her nothing, no wasted motion, no adjustment, no fumbling. The corners appeared as if summoned. His tactical assessment mode kicked in automatically, the same neural pathway that identified angles of fire and weak points in perimeter security. This woman moved like someone who'd been trained. Not like a nurse. Like something else. Long night, he asked, pulling a bottle of water from the small refrigerator in the corner. His voice carried the rasp of someone who'd been extubated recently. They all are, Sarah replied without looking up. One measured breath between sentences. One calm intonation. Her response contained no information and closed no doors, a perfect evasion delivered with such gentleness that it seemed like simple kindness rather than operational security. She folded the 4th sheet. The 5th. You should be in bed, Rodriguez. Doctor's orders. He smiled despite himself. You're not going to tell me what I should be doing. I'm going to tell you that infected sutures don't care what anyone wants. She finally looked at him, and for a fraction of a second, too brief to be certain he'd actually witnessed it, her eyes reflected something that didn't belong in a hospital break room. Infection has no respect for rank or will to live. It just spreads. The SEAL stood there with his water bottle held loosely at his side, trying to place a recognition that his conscious mind couldn't quite access. Something in her bearing. Something in the economy of her movements. Something in the way she'd used the word rank like it meant something to her personally. He'd served with women like that before, women who carried themselves with a particular gravity, as if they'd already spent their lives accounting for the cost of things. But that had been in the mountains, and this was Norfolk, and there was no logical intersection between those 2 points of his reality. Get some sleep, Rodriguez, Sarah said, returning her attention to the linens. Your body's doing enough work without your brain keeping it awake. He left without another word, but she heard him pause in the doorway for just a moment too long before continuing back toward his room. She didn't look up. Looking up would have been confirmation, and she wasn't in the business of confirming anything to anyone right now. The break room door closed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Sarah allowed herself to breathe normally for the first time that shift. The controlled breathing, 1 count in, 4 counts held, 6 counts released, wasn't meditation or stress management. It was a combat medic's oxygen discipline, taught to personnel who might one day be trying to control bleeding while their own nervous system screamed at them to panic. She'd learned it in 2016 in a place that officially didn't exist anymore, from a man who'd taught her that pain was information, that shock was survivable, that staying calm was a weapon. She opened her locker at the end of her shift break, the metal door swinging inward to reveal the small world she'd created here, extra scrubs folded precisely on the top shelf, her personal items in the bottom. The jacket hung on the hook, simple dark blue, nothing expensive, nothing that would draw attention. But sewn into the jacket's interior lining, in thread that matched the lining fabric perfectly, was a patch. A unit patch. Faded colors, fraying edges, bearing a designation that hadn't officially existed since 2019. It wasn't visible to anyone who wasn't already inside the secret. It was the kind of thing you kept after a unit dissolved, after the operations ended, after you were reassigned to something that required a different name and a different uniform. Sarah traced it with one fingertip, her touch featherlight. The patch was smaller than a playing card, its embroidery dulled by time and countless launderings. But it was real. It existed in the material world just like she did, a small anchor to the person she'd been before naval intelligence decided she was better suited to watching hospitals from the inside than leading people in the field. The Cedar Creek Medical ICU patient roster hung on the break room bulletin board next to the staff schedule and a faded poster about hand hygiene. Sarah had memorized it during her lunch break on her second week here, not because it was particularly difficult, but because she'd been trained to memorize things. Room 347 housed Rodriguez, the SEAL with the surgical scar. Room 349 held a former ranger with a broken femur and an appendectomy scar that suggested field medicine at FOB Shank, Loga Province. Room 351 was occupied by a Marine classified as a logistics specialist, though his bearing said something closer to force recon. The pattern was clear if you knew how to read it. Cedar Creek Medical was treating recuperating Spec Ops personnel, which meant Cedar Creek Medical was where someone with financial interests would look to maximize billing. Dr. Mercer looked to maximize billing. His rounds with the residents had taken him through the ward twice that evening, his clipboard bearing notes that didn't always match what Sarah could see in the actual chart entries. Extended observation, he'd ordered for Rodriguez. Specialized care protocols for the Marine in 351. Additional diagnostic imaging for the Ranger in 349. Each order added thousands of dollars to billing codes that insurance companies would examine for approximately 7 seconds before approving. $17 million, according to her brief. That was the amount Mercer had allegedly extracted from military health insurance over the past 3 years. $17 million in fraudulent billing, funneled through hospital systems via Spec Ops patients whose paperwork was already classified and therefore harder to audit. The Pentagon noticed eventually. They always did. So they sent Naval Intelligence, and Naval Intelligence sent Captain Sarah Chen, a decorated field operative with credentials as a night shift ICU nurse and a gift for staying invisible while watching everything. She'd been invisible for 8 months. The break room door opened at 0015 hours, and Dr. Mercer walked through it with the carriage of someone accustomed to owning every space he entered. He was in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that belonged to country clubs and sailing regattas, the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone in a position to enforce the word. His eyes passed over Sarah like she was furniture. She was folding sheets at the table, and he was in need of coffee, and the two facts existed in completely separate universes in his assessment. Night shift nurses, he said to no one in particular, speaking as if she weren't present even though she was, seemed to develop an unfortunate habit of believing they understand medical protocols. I've seen it dozens of times. They work after regular hours, their critical thinking abilities diminish, and suddenly they think they can make clinical decisions. Sarah folded the sheet in front of her without responding. One corner. Another. The precision remained absolute. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. The only thing that shifted was something deeper, a recalibration of attention, a settling of focus like a camera lens finding its mark. She'd been trained to absorb insults without reaction. More than that, she'd been trained to understand that insults from men like Mercer were just noise, data points to be filed and analyzed, irrelevant to the actual work. The coffee machine gurgled to life behind him, emitting a sound like something dying slowly in the dark. He poured his coffee without offering to pour hers, without acknowledging that he'd been heard or that anyone had heard him. He left the break room the way he'd entered it, as if the space had simply rearranged itself around his needs. Sarah folded the next sheet. The next. The rhythm continued, meditative and mechanical, the way her hands had learned to work when her mind needed to be somewhere else. She was thinking about billing codes now, about the specific patients Mercer had flagged for extended observation, about the insurance companies that would eventually notice the pattern if someone knew how to show them what they were looking for. She was thinking about the Navy SEAL in room 347 and what exactly he was doing in Cedar Creek Medical if official paperwork suggested he was just a medic. She was thinking about the 8 months stretching behind her like a trail through hostile terrain, and the unknown number of months stretching ahead. But mostly, she was thinking about the moment when everything she'd worked for would finally matter, when the mask would slip and the night shift nurse would become what she actually was. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was for listening and learning and remaining invisible. That was what Captain Sarah Chen did. That was what she'd always done. That was what she would continue to do until the moment came when she didn't have to anymore. The hallway outside room 347 smelled like antiseptic and something darker underneath, the copper iron scent of blood that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. Sarah was updating the vital signs chart when Dr. Mercer's shadow fell across the clipboard, cold and deliberate as a blade. Nurse Chen. Not a greeting. A summons. She turned, already knowing what his face would show, that particular expression he reserved for moments when he could perform his cruelty in front of an audience. The SEAL's family was visible through the open doorway, a woman in her 60s, a younger man in a military-cut shirt, a teenage girl holding flowers that had already begun to wilt in the recycled hospital air. Mercer held up the chart with manufactured fury, his movements precise and theatrical. These vital signs are documented incorrectly. His voice carried down the hallway like a broadcast, designed to be heard. Are you incompetent, or simply careless? Sarah took one measured breath. The kind of breath she'd learned to take during her first tour, when RPG fire hammered the forward operating base and panic was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. She felt the family's eyes on her back, the weight of their judgment, their assumption that she was exactly what Dr. Mercer was suggesting, incompetent, careless, a liability wearing scrubs. The chart reflects exactly what happened, Doctor. Her voice remained level, clinical. His pressure spiked at 0200 hours when he shifted in bed. I documented the trend and monitored for 10 minutes before it stabilized at. I don't need excuses from clipboard Cindy. He cut her off, and the nickname landed exactly as he'd intended, small enough that he could claim it was a joke if anyone objected, sharp enough to draw blood. I need accuracy. Perhaps night shift is too demanding for your skill level. The woman in the doorway flinched. The younger man's jaw tightened. The teenager looked away, embarrassed for a stranger. Sarah felt the tears come before she could stop them, not from shame, but from the sheer exhaustion of 8 months of this, 8 months of holding her identity behind her eyes while letting her voice apologize for things she hadn't done wrong. One tear escaped and traced down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her gaze never leaving his. The documentation is accurate, Doctor. It was the tone that did it, not defiant, but immovable. Like stone. Like someone who had absorbed far worse than words and simply continued breathing. For a moment, something flickered behind Mercer's eyes. Uncertainty. A brief recognition that he was not breaking what he was trying to break. Then his mask of superiority slid back into place, and he turned away, speaking loudly enough for the family to hear. "Make sure it doesn't happen again." He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing with purpose. The family retreated into room 347, their discomfort now directed at the hospital, at the system, at the man who had just humiliated a nurse in front of them. The woman with the flowers closed the door quietly, as if softness could somehow undo what they'd witnessed. Sarah returned to her charting station, her hands moving through the motions of documentation with mechanical precision. She added a note to the classified file on her encrypted phone, Mercer Confrontation 0340. Witness, family members present. Pattern confirms aggressive behavior escalating under stress. Possible indication he's aware of billing discrepancies. The rest of the shift passed in the particular silence that follows humiliation. No one asked her to help with difficult patients. No one stopped by the charting station for casual conversation. By the time Sarah finished her rounds at 0600, the message had already spread through the night shift like a virus. Mercer had called her out, publicly, and any association with her had become a liability. At 1400 hours, Sarah clocked in for her afternoon shift and headed to the break room to eat the lunch she'd prepared that morning: cold rice, steamed chicken, green beans. Practical food. Fuel, not enjoyment. She set her lunch bag on the central table and was reaching for a chair when 3 nurses who were already seated immediately stood, murmuring excuses that weren't excuses. "Need to check on my patient. Forgot something at home. Promised I'd help in pediatrics." They left, their chairs scraping back with unnecessary force, and Sarah was alone at the table in a room that suddenly felt too large. She could hear them talking just outside the break room door, their voices deliberately pitched to carry back to her. "Did you see what Mercer said to her? I heard he's been documenting every mistake. If he fires her, that's not our problem." Sarah ate methodically, one forkful per breath, the way she'd learned to eat in field camps where meals happened between firefights and you never knew if the next one would interrupt digestion. The rice tasted like cardboard. That was fine. Taste was irrelevant. Calories were the mission. Through the thin walls, she could hear the ward humming with afternoon activity, monitors beeping in a distant rhythm, a doctor laughing somewhere near the nurse's station, a patient calling for help. And underneath it all, the whispers that everyone thought she couldn't hear but that were designed to be heard, the ambient cruelty of a workplace deciding that someone was worth excluding. She thought of Jackson Reeves in room 347, the SEAL she didn't yet know had been a combat medic in the Hindu Kush, the man who'd replaced her after her reassignment to Naval Intelligence. She'd seen him once during the handover, though he wouldn't remember. She'd watched him work with the same precision and care that she'd always brought to field medicine, the same understanding that death lived in the margins and attention was the only thing that kept it at bay. That afternoon, she finished her shift and walked past the unit board where Dr. Mercer had posted the disciplinary write-up. She stopped in front of it, reading every word carefully, committing the exact language to memory. Formal notice of insubordination. Nurse Sarah Chen has demonstrated persistent failure to follow established chain of command protocols. On multiple occasions, she has questioned medical judgment in the presence of patients and family members. This behavior undermines hospital authority and creates liability. Further infractions will result in suspension or termination. Signed, Dr. Raymond Mercer, Chief of Medical Services. The write-up was a masterpiece of documentation, every word chosen to build a paper trail, every accusation vague enough that he couldn't be directly contradicted but damaging enough that she would look guilty if she tried. Sarah took out her phone and photographed it with the same clinical detachment she'd learned to bring to recording evidence of fraud. The image went into her encrypted mission file, labeled with timestamp and context. 17 photographs of similar write-ups and complaints, each one building the narrative that Sarah Chen was a problem employee. What Dr. Mercer didn't understand was that every photograph was also a crime scene. Every write-up was documentation of his own escalation, proof of the campaign he was running against a nurse he had no idea was recording him, monitoring him, gathering the evidence that would eventually tell a very different story than the one he was constructing. But defending herself would mean exposing the investigation. It would mean filing a complaint, hiring a lawyer, making noise in the hospital system. It would mean alerting Mercer to the fact that he was under surveillance. And the whole reason she was here, the reason she'd traded her dress blues and her command for night shifts and humiliation, was that 17 Spec Ops patients had been financially devastated by this man's fraud. One of them had taken his own life 3 months after discharge, buried under $400,000 in medical debt from a hospital stay that should have cost half that. Sarah walked to her locker and opened it. Inside, hanging from a hook on the inside of her jacket, was the unit patch, faded now, worn soft by 37 months of being carried, the embroidered insignia barely visible. It showed the call sign she'd earned, the unit she'd served with, the identity that was waiting for her on the other side of this operation. She touched it once, just the briefest contact with her fingertips, and took one measured breath. The break room had gone quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. This time it felt like the moment before something changed. This time it felt like the moment before a mission went hot, when everything shifted from surveillance to action. And then the alarm screamed. The alarm screamed at 03 for 7 hours. 3 sharp bursts that turned the quiet hallway into something alive and predatory. Sarah's eyes snapped open from the charting station. The monitors in room 347 were throwing a tantrum, the ventilator's rhythm fracturing into chaos. Blood pressure collapsing. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. The SEAL's chest wound had reopened catastrophically, and the white sheets were turning red in real time. She was moving before her brain finished processing. Not running, moving with the economical speed of someone who'd practiced this exact scenario under fire in the Hindu Kush, where hesitation wasn't a luxury. Her feet didn't make a sound on the tile. Combat boots, still laced tight, muscle memory encoded in her spine. The ER attending, Dr. Hayes, competent but cautious, was still 3 steps behind her when she hit the threshold of room 347. The SEAL's chest cavity was a catastrophe. The sutures had given way. The bleeding was fast and arterial, the kind of hemorrhage that killed men in minutes, not hours. The monitors screamed their electronic warning. 60 over 40. 58 over 36. His oxygen sat dropping past 70, heading toward the point of no return. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with the particular rage of a man watching his authority erode in real time. His mouth was already opening to issue some directive, some assertion of hierarchy. He didn't get the words out. Sarah's shoulder connected with his sternum, not violent, just decisive, and he stumbled sideways into the doorframe. Not hard enough to hurt him. Hard enough to move him. Scalpel. Crash cart. Now, she said to the first respiratory tech. Her voice had changed. It was lower, clipped, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The deferential nurse was gone. What remained was something else entirely. She grabbed the scalpel from the sterile field, her fingers closing around it with the certainty of 1,000 repetitions. The metal was cold and good and exactly the right weight. Not the combat knife she'd used in the mountain villages 5 years ago, that had been different, desperate, performed on a Marine with a sucking chest wound while explosions lit the sky orange. This was cleaner. This was a hospital. This was different. This was the same. What are you doing? Mercer's voice cracked with fury and confusion. You can't, that's outside your scope. Sarah made the incision. Between the 4th and 5th ribs, right lateral line, the anatomy map in her muscle memory as clear as any textbook. The blade moved with the precision of a surgeon, but the speed was combat medic fast. Blood welled immediately. She set the scalpel down and her fingers entered the chest cavity without hesitation, feeling for the source of the bleed with the same focus she'd used to save Jackson Reeves in a mud compound under mortar fire. The lung was intact. The pressure was the problem. The attending surgeon, Dr. Hayes, burst through the door and froze. His eyes tracked what Sarah's hands were doing, and something in his face shifted. Recognition, maybe. Horror. Profound respect. The kind of recognition that only came from understanding what level of training you were witnessing. The monitors climbed. 60. 70. the numbers moving upward like a prayer being answered. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered. "Who taught you that?" Sarah didn't answer. She was applying direct pressure to the arterial bleed, her fingers working the wounded vessel with the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be learned in any hospital. Field thoracotomy. The procedure that separated the living from the dead in the minutes before evacuation. She'd learned it in a training compound outside San Diego, then refined it in a village compound outside Kandahar while her unit screamed into radios for a medical evacuation that was 20 minutes away. The SEAL's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, just a moment, his gaze locked on Sarah's face, and something flickered across his expression. Confusion. Recognition. Something deeper than either. His mouth formed a word that never reached the air. Vork. "Stay with me," Sarah said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "We've got you. You're not dying today." The monitors continued climbing. 80. 90. The rhythm stabilizing into something resembling normal. Hayes was moving now, his hands joining hers in the chest cavity, taking over the procedure with the confidence of someone who'd just realized he was standing next to someone trained in military trauma protocols that went 3 layers deeper than civilian medicine. "Suction," Sarah said. The tech moved. Fresh ONEG running. "Going in now," the second nurse confirmed. "Pressure dressing. Get me a chest tube, 36 French, and prep for emergency CT once we stabilize vitals." It wasn't a request. It was command structure, pure and unfiltered. The language of someone accustomed to calling the shots when lives hung in the balance. The attending surgeon noticed. His hands moved faster, his focus sharpening. When someone that composed, that competent, started giving orders in your trauma bay, you followed them. The wound stopped hemorrhaging. Sarah's fingers found the vessel, applied pressure, held it while Hayes worked the repair with practiced hands. The monitors showed 95-60 seconds. Still low, still critical, but no longer precipitous. The curve had bent. The SEAL was going to live. It took 8 minutes. By the end of it, the surgical team had taken over completely, and Sarah stepped back from the bed with her hands held above her waist, letting them see what she'd done. Blood on her sleeves. Blood on her hands. Blood that marked her as something other than what her uniform suggested. Dr. Hayes looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd started her shift at Cedar Creek Medical 8 months ago. That was advanced combat life support. Field-grade thoracotomy. That was training, Sarah said quietly. "I'm going on break." But she wasn't going on break. She was already calculating what would happen next, how this moment would ripple. She'd blown 8 months of surveillance and careful documentation for a life-saving action that couldn't be hidden. The fraud investigation was compromised. Her cover was compromised. Everything she'd built, the careful anonymity, the tactical patience, the ability to document Dr. Mercer's billing scheme without detection, had just collapsed into a single desperate act that saved the Navy SEAL in room 347. She turned toward the door. Dr. Mercer was standing against the far wall, his face the color of spoiled milk. His eyes were moving in rapid calculation, and she could see the moment he made his decision. Not a man defeated. A man strategizing. His hand was already moving to his phone, already opening the voice memo app, already beginning to document everything she'd done outside hospital protocol. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent witnesses to what was coming next. She walked past him without acknowledgement, her wet hand swinging at her sides, her composure intact and absolute. But every step toward the break room was a step toward the end of everything she'd built here. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm, the moment when the mission goes from surveillance to combat. Dr. Mercer's fingers were still moving on his phone screen, typing with the fury of a man documenting an offense he planned to weaponize. Sarah reached the break room, ran cold water over her hands until the blood washed away, and watched the pink water spiral down the drain. Somewhere down the hallway, a Navy SEAL was stabilizing. Somewhere in the hospital administration, a chain of events had begun that would end with formal complaints to the state medical board, allegations of practicing medicine without a license, accusations of insubordination, and a termination letter signed before dawn. She knew how this worked. She'd read the scenarios during mission prep. She'd prepared for compromise. She just hadn't expected it to happen because she'd done something right. Security arrived at 0630. 2 officers in grey uniforms, their badges catching the first light from the hospital corridor windows. Sarah was already dressed in street clothes, having anticipated this by approximately 47 minutes. She'd learned long ago that men like Dr. Mercer operated on predictable timelines. The decision to fire her would have been made the moment her scalpel touched that first rib. The termination letter would have been drafted before Jackson Reeves's chest wall closed. Now came the theater of institutional protection. Dr. Mercer stood beside the security officers with his expression perfectly calibrated, professionally neutral, the face of a man following protocol, not pursuing a vendetta. He held a folder the color of old bone. "Captain Chen, thank you for coming in early," he said, though she hadn't come in early. She'd never left. She'd showered in the employee locker room and changed into the clothes she kept in a duffel under her bunk, the same tactical efficiency she'd applied to every other aspect of this 8-month operation. Hospital Policy Section 7.4, Subsection C, Mercer continued, his voice smooth as surgical lubricant, prohibits unauthorized personnel from performing procedures outside their documented scope of practice. The emergency thoracotomy you performed yesterday, he paused, letting the words settle like sediment, creates institutional liability we cannot tolerate, regardless of outcome. Sarah said nothing. Measured breathing. 1 inhalation, 1 exhalation, the same rhythm she'd used in the Hindu Kush when rounds were coming through the walls of the forward operating base. The silence stretched. It wasn't fear. It was inventory, counting the ways this had been calculated to destroy her, the precision of his counterattack, how expertly he'd transformed her decision to save a life into grounds for professional annihilation. "We filed formal complaints with the State Board of Nursing," Mercer said, opening the folder. "Allegations of unauthorized surgical intervention, violation of scope of practice guidelines, insubordination during a medical emergency, and patient endangerment. The documentation is thorough." He smiled slightly. "I believe in creating a clear record." Each word was a brick in a wall. Mercer had spent the night constructing something immaculate, a paper fortress of liability and violation, meticulous enough that her own actions became the evidence against her. The brilliance of it was almost beautiful. Almost. Sarah's eyes moved across the documents without reading them. She'd already anticipated the charges. Unauthorized surgical intervention, accurate. Violation of scope of practice, accurate. Insubordination, a matter of interpretation, but accurate in the way that mattered most, it was documentable. The board would see a nurse who'd overstepped. The board would not see a Navy intelligence captain conducting a covert investigation into a fraud scheme that had cost taxpayers $17 million. The board would not see that Jackson Reeves, the Navy SEAL in room 347, was alive because of her. "You're terminated effective immediately," Mercer said. "Your security clearance for hospital access is revoked. You'll surrender your badge and access card now. Security will escort you to collect personal items from your locker, and then you'll exit through the employee entrance. The hospital will not contest unemployment benefits, but we will cooperate fully with any state board inquiry." It was executed with the precision of a surgical strike. Remove her access. Remove her presence. Remove any ability to gather further evidence or intervene if he continued his operations. The timing was perfect, the early morning, before shift change, when minimal staff would witness her walking out in street clothes with a security escort. Before Jackson could try to speak. Before questions could be asked. Sarah nodded once. A small movement, barely perceptible. She unclipped her badge from her shirt, the badge she'd worn for 243 days, the shield that had granted her access to every file, every record, every financial trail leading directly to Mercer's fraud infrastructure. She placed it on the desk between them, the plastic clicking softly against the laminate. The sound was like the closing of a door. "My key," one of the security officers asked, his tone professional and kind. He was probably a good man. He was following policy. He didn't know he was participating in the destruction of an active naval intelligence operation. Sarah retrieved her locker key from her pocket and handed it over. The officer took it with a slight nod of acknowledgement, not apology, exactly, but recognition that this situation carried some weight beyond standard termination procedure. He'd probably escorted out plenty of people. Not many who stood this still while their lives were being dismantled. The walk to the employee lockers took 3 minutes. Sarah's heart rate remained at 62 beats per minute. Her hands remained steady. The security officers flanked her with the gentle professionalism of men who'd learned that most terminations involved anger or tears, and they were clearly confused by a woman who walked like a soldier toward her own professional execution. She opened her locker, the one assigned to Sarah Chen, RN, on the plastic nameplate, and collected the 2 items she'd stored there: a framed photo of her son David, age 4, taken before the last deployment to the Hindu Kush, and her old unit patch, faded to near transparency, sewn into the lining of a jacket she never wore to work. The jacket was in the locker too. She put it on. It still smelled like desert dust and memory. The whole process took 8 minutes. By 06:38, she was standing in the employee parking lot as the sun climbed above the Norfolk skyline, casting long shadows across the asphalt. A security officer handed her a printed copy of her termination letter in a manila envelope. "If you need to contest this," he said carefully, "HR has the procedure listed on the back page." Sarah took the envelope. She didn't open it. She already knew what it contained. She already knew how many ways Mercer had ensured that her defense would be impossible without revealing her classified status. He'd built a cage of policy and documentation that had no exit for someone bound by secrecy. She drove home. She showered. She sat on her couch and waited for the Naval Intelligence Extraction Team to make contact, which they would do through channels she couldn't use from the hospital anymore. Her cover was blown. Her mission was compromised. 8 months of surveillance, of documentation, of meticulous evidence gathering, all of it would need to be cross-referenced now through official channels, which meant lawyers, which meant delays, which meant Mercer might have time to run, to hide assets, to destroy evidence. But Jackson Reeves was alive. That afternoon, Sarah drove back to Cedar Creek Medical. Not to the hospital entrance, she had no access anymore. Instead, she parked in the rear lot and entered through the laundry facility, where she knew the door code from her first week working nights. The laundry smelled like industrial detergent and commercial dryers working in parallel, a smell that had become as familiar to her as the smell of antiseptic or blood. A woman named Teresa worked the afternoon shift in laundry, older, kind, one of the few staff members who'd asked Sarah questions about her day without judgment. She looked up from the sorting bin when Sarah walked in holding the white uniforms she'd worn for the last night shift. "Honey, what are you doing here?" Teresa asked, setting down a stack of contaminated scrubs. "I came to turn these in," Sarah said simply. Teresa's face shifted through several expressions at once: surprise, then understanding, then sadness. "You got fired." "Terminated, yes." "Because of yesterday?" "Because you saved that seal." Sarah nodded once. She set the scrubs on the counter, her 3 pairs of white pants, her for-shift tops, all of them laundered to precise standards. She began folding the first pair of pants, her hands moving through the motions with the same precision she'd once used to fold her dress blues in her locker at Naval Station Norfolk. Left third fold. Right third fold. Bottom tuck. Crisp crease. Corner to corner. "That's bullshit," Teresa said quietly. "You saved his life." "Hospital policy," Sarah said. She was folding the second pair now. The work was meditative, the small act of completion and order in the midst of institutional chaos. Unauthorized personnel performing procedures outside their scope. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" Teresa said. It wasn't a question. Sarah didn't answer. She continued folding, each movement precise, each crease sharp enough to cut. The scrub stacked into a small white tower on the counter between them. This was the bottom, not the firing, though that had been meant to destroy her. Not the loss of her cover, though that had been meant to compromise her mission. This was the actual Nadia, the moment of folding away an identity she'd worn for 8 months, returning to the hospital as a ghost to surrender the uniform that proved she'd ever been here at all. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed with the static hum of electricity and institutional apathy. The dryers tumbled. Somewhere in the hospital above her, Jackson Reeves was recovering in room 347, alive because of a decision she'd made that had cost her everything. Sarah was placing the final folded scrub top on the counter when the employee entrance door banged open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Her 16-year-old son David burst through, breathing hard, his teenage frame still awkward with growth. He was carrying something under his arm, a shadow box, darkwood, the kind used for displaying military decorations. His face was flushed with a mixture of fury and urgency that only a teenager could achieve. "Mom," he shouted, his voice cracking on the word. "They need to see these. They need to see what you are." Sarah's entire body went cold. Not from fear. From the sudden, catastrophic understanding that her 8-month operation had just been destroyed by a 16-year-old's righteous anger and a shadow box that contained every secret she'd ever kept. The box was open. Inside, arranged on white silk backing, were decorations that gleamed under the harsh laundry lighting like accusations: a silver star, a bronze star with Vela device, 2 purple hearts, a combat action ribbon. Proof. Absolute, irrefutable proof of exactly who she was. "David, no," Sarah said, her voice dropping to the command frequency she normally reserved for crisis situations. "You don't understand." But he was already moving past her, already heading toward the door that led to the main hospital corridor, already carrying her classified service record in his teenage hands like a weapon. David pushed through the employee entrance like a man on a mission, 17 years old and unburdened by the weight of secrets that had crushed his mother for 8 months. The shadow box caught the fluorescent light, medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, each one a small revolution waiting to detonate. Sarah saw at the same moment the laundry manager turned away, suddenly very interested in the linen counts. The air pressure changed. The kind of change that comes before lightning strikes. "Mom, they need to see these," David called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a teenager who had no idea he was about to burn down his mother's entire carefully constructed world. Sarah moved toward him on pure instinct, not the hesitant shuffle of the dismissed night shift nurse, but the efficient stride of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. Her hand reached for the shadow box, but it was already too late. He was already turning toward the main corridor. Already moving toward the door that connected the laundry to the hospital proper. Already carrying her classified service record in his teenage hands like a weapon he didn't understand. "David, wait," Sarah's voice dropped an octave. The command frequency. The one she'd reserved for situations where people needed to move and move fast. But he was already gone, already pushing through the double doors, his footsteps echoing down the tile corridor toward the east wing where room 347 sat like the epicenter of everything that was about to unravel. Room 347. Where Jackson Reeves, the Navy SEAL whose chest she'd cracked open with a combat knife 14 hours ago, was currently watching the hospital corridor with the instincts of a man who'd spent 8 years noticing things other people missed. His wound was dressed. His vitals were stable. His eyes were tracking movement with the kind of focused attention that comes from 3 combat tours in the Hindu Kush and 1 near-death experience courtesy of Dr. Mercer's negligence. The attending surgeon froze first, the one who'd stepped back during the thoracotomy, whose hands had trembled while Sarah's moved with the precision of a surgical laser. He stood in the hallway outside room 347, reading Jackson's post-op chart, when David entered carrying the shadow box like an artifact from a museum that shouldn't exist inside a civilian hospital. The surgeon's eyes widened. The chart almost slipped from his hands. Jackson whispered it first. Barely audible. A single word that rewired every assumption he'd held about the night shift nurse who'd saved his life. Valkyrie. His eyes widened as recognition flooded through him, not of her face, but of something deeper. The call sign from classified mission briefs. The phantom reputation that circulated through SEAL team channels. The operator who'd been pulled from the field under circumstances nobody was cleared to discuss, reassigned to intelligence work, vanished from the operational roster 6 years ago. Valkyrie. Not just a nurse. Not clipboard Cynthia with improper documentation. Valkyrie, the tactical call sign of a captain-level operator whose presence in room 347 had never been an accident. A Marine Corps colonel stood in the adjacent room, visiting his brother who'd undergone shoulder reconstruction that morning. He heard the whisper. He saw David's shadow box. His military instincts activated like a switch flipping in his brain. He stepped into the hallway, his dress uniform crisp as a blade, and began reading Sarah's Silver Star citation aloud in the measured cadence of a man reciting scripture. For gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces in Helmand Province, Captain Sarah Chen displayed extraordinary valor in direct contact with hostile personnel. Under sustained enemy fire, Captain Chen coordinated evacuation of 3 wounded Marines while maintaining suppressive fire, treating critical trauma injuries with field-expedient measures that saved all 3 lives. Her actions demonstrated command presence, medical expertise, and combat courage that exemplified the highest traditions of naval service. The words hung in the air like incense. Medical staff began appearing in doorways, nurses who'd worked with Sarah for 8 months without knowing they'd been working beside a decorated combat officer. Orderlies. Residents. The attending surgeon from the emergency thoracotomy, his chart forgotten, his hands no longer trembling but his face pale as bone. They emerged into the corridor the way people move toward a fire they can't explain, drawn to something that suddenly recontextualized everything they'd witnessed. That's when Dr. Mercer arrived. He moved through the corridor with the certainty of a man coming to verify that the inconvenient night shift nurse had truly been removed from his hospital. His badge clipped to his coat pocket, his stethoscope draped like a crown, his face arranged in the expression of someone about to congratulate himself on removing a problem. He turned the corner toward room 347 at the precise moment when a 2-star general from Naval Intelligence, uniformed, official, radiating the kind of authority that makes doctors flinch, rendered a formal salute to the shadow box in David's trembling hands. The general's hand rose to his forehead in the precise gesture of military respect. Not casual. Not informal. A full-dress salute, the kind that existed only for ceremony and supreme recognition of rank. His eyes tracked the medals as they caught the hallway light, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 purple hearts arranged like stations of a cross, and then the final medal catching last, the one that made even hardened military officers hold their breath, a Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor in the entire Navy. Dr. Mercer's face drained the way a sink drains when someone pulls the plug. His mouth opened. His hand rose as if to speak. But no words came out. His feet began moving backward with the jerky automaticity of someone whose brain had triggered a flight response his body was struggling to execute. Dr. Mercer, the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, patient, completely lethal. We need to discuss your termination procedures for Captain Chen. Now. By the time Pentagon liaisons appeared at the end of the corridor asking specifically for Captain Chen, call sign Valkyrie, Mercer was already backing toward the stairwell with the look of a man who'd just realized he'd been operating under a catastrophic misunderstanding of his own importance. His face had the waxy quality of someone watching their entire life experience a sudden gravitational shift. The liaisons moved past him without acknowledgement, focused entirely on Sarah, who stood in the laundry room doorway with her hand on David's shoulder while her son's proud eyes tracked every moment of the recognition unfolding in the corridor. A nurse Sarah had never spoken to, the one who'd watched Mercer post the disciplinary write-up, who'd averted her eyes in sympathy but never made eye contact, raised her phone and began filming. The video captured Mercer's stammered attempts at explanation, his hands moving in defenseless gestures as he tried to reframe the termination decision to military brass. His voice cracked. Twice. His words tangled like fishing line caught on a propeller. The video captured it all, the full panic of a man realizing he'd assaulted the professional reputation of someone whose actual identity existed several security clearance levels above his access. By that evening, the video had circulated through the Cedar Creek Medical nursing staff chat. By the next morning, it had reached other military medical facilities across the Tidewater region. By noon, it had landed in the inbox of Dr. Raymond Hartwig, a Navy surgeon who'd served in Kandahar 12 years ago, who'd been Mercer's medical school mentor, who'd taught him everything about trauma surgery before Mercer had somehow weaponized that knowledge into a billing scheme that preyed on the very soldiers they'd both sworn to protect. Sarah stood in the hospital corridor watching her cover disintegrate like paper in a rainstorm, her true identity now exposed to the entire Cedar Creek medical community, her classified presence in that building no longer a secret she could contain. 8 months of undercover documentation, all of it rendered meaningless by a shadow box and a teenager's pride. She placed her hand on David's shoulder in silent acknowledgement that their lives had fundamentally changed. The hand on his shoulder was steady. Her breathing was steady. But something inside her shifted, not fear, not regret, but the sensation of finally setting down a weight so heavy she'd almost forgotten it was there. The attending surgeon approached slowly, the way you approach a person you've misjudged but suddenly understand you've misjudged. "I saw what you did," he said quietly, glancing toward room 347 where Jackson Reeves was tracking the conversation with the intensity of a man who'd lived through things most civilians couldn't imagine. During the emergency procedure. That wasn't nurse training. That was combat medic certification. 3 tours, Sarah said simply. Hindu Kush. Medical support for SEAL operations. Her voice had changed now, it carried the weight of command, of authority that couldn't be dismissed or diminished. After I was reassigned to intelligence, Naval Intelligence embedded me here to monitor Spec Ops patients and track Dr. Mercer's billing practices. I documented everything. Every inflated charge. Every kickback from supply companies. Every procedure he billed for that never happened. The attending surgeon nodded slowly. The case against him is going to be substantial. 17 million, Sarah said. That's what I documented. 17 million in fraudulent billing targeting military personnel whose treatment was covered by military insurance. He chose his victims carefully, operators who wouldn't ask questions, who couldn't access their own medical records without going through command channels. A phone rang in Sarah's jacket pocket, secure line, government encryption, the kind of call that came from people whose job titles existed in spaces that didn't officially exist on organizational charts. She answered. Listened. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When she hung up, David was watching her with new understanding dawning across his face. That was Naval Intelligence, he said. Not a question. Operation Oversight needs a lead investigator, Sarah replied. NCIS headquarters in Norfolk. I leave next week. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one her team had given her before she left the Hindu Kush, the one she'd kept hidden for 8 months while enduring Mercer's humiliation, while absorbing every insult with the composure of someone who understood that patience was a weapon. The patch was worn soft from handling, the embroidery fading, but it carried the weight of every mission where she'd chosen other people's lives over her own safety. What happened next changed everything. What happens to Dr. Mercer, 6 months later, standing in the rain outside a medical supply warehouse in Portsmouth, loading boxes into a van while wearing a uniform that would never again be surgical scrubs? That's the story that hasn't finished writing itself yet. But Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse who was never just a nurse, would be the one writing the final chapters. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the moment when quiet strength becomes undeniable power. Comment below, would you have walked away, or would you have saved him like Sarah did? Let's talk about the heroes walking among us right now, invisible until the moment they're needed most.